The late evening lights of Manhattan sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Metropolitan Museum as the annual charity gala was in full swing. Alexander Chen adjusted his bow tie, forcing a polite smile as another group of investors approached him. At 42, he had become used to these social obligations, but they still felt hollow. His company, Tech Vision Global, had just crossed the $50 billion valuation mark, yet success felt strangely empty tonight. He was making his way to the bar when he caught a whiff of jasmine perfume, a scent that stopped him in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat as he turned around. There she was, looking even more beautiful than he remembered. Catherine stood just a few feet away, her black evening gown catching the light as she spoke to an elderly couple. Her dark hair was shorter now, falling just above her shoulders, but her laugh was exactly as he remembered it. 10 years. It had been 10 years since their divorce, and seeing her now felt like a punch to the gut. Catherine hadn't noticed him yet, giving Alexander a moment to collect himself. The last time they'd spoken was during the final divorce proceedings, where harsh words and bitter accusations had flown from both sides. Just as he was considering a quick retreat, Catherine turned and their eyes met. The smile froze on her face, and Alexander watched as several emotions flickered across her features: surprise, panic, and something else he couldn't quite read. For a moment, they both stood frozen, the bustling gala continuing around them like a distant movie scene. "Alexander," she said softly, excusing herself from her previous conversation. "I didn't expect to see you here." "It's been a while," he managed, his throat suddenly dry. Up close, he could see the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched her champagne glass. "You look well." "Thank you. I saw the news about Tech Vision's latest acquisition." "Congratulations." The formal pleasantries felt wrong, considering their history. They had once shared everything: dreams, fears, a home. Now they were exchanging corporate small talk like strangers. As they struggled through awkward conversation, Alexander noticed something off about Catherine's behavior. She seemed nervous, constantly checking her phone, her eyes darting to the exit. When another guest mentioned their children's education program, Catherine practically flinched. "I should go," she said abruptly, cutting off the conversation. It was nice seeing you, Alexander. Before he could respond, she was already moving through the crowd, leaving behind only the lingering scent of jasmine and 1,000 questions. Alexander watched her hurried departure with growing suspicion. Catherine had always been composed, even during their worst arguments. This scattered, anxious behavior wasn't like her at all. Later that evening, as he nursed a scotch at the bar, he overheard two women talking. "Catherine's boy must be about 9 now," one said. "Growing up so fast." Alexander's glass stopped halfway to his lips. 9 years. The timing nagged at him. Their divorce had been finalized 10 years ago, but the last time they'd been together was. His mind raced back to their final night together, a desperate attempt at reconciliation that had ended in more hurt. The timing would match perfectly. But surely Catherine would have told him if. The scotch suddenly tasted bitter in his mouth. Alexander pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over the keyboard. After a moment's hesitation, he opened their mutual friend Robert's social media profile, scrolling through recent photos. There, at a summer barbecue 2 months ago. Catherine was there, and beside her stood a young boy with familiar dark eyes and a determined set to his jaw that Alexander recognized from his own childhood photos. The room seemed to spin slightly. Alexander gripped the bar counter, his knuckles turning white. Could it be possible? Had Catherine kept this secret from him all these years? As the pieces started falling into place, anger and hurt warred with a desperate need to know the truth. He signaled the bartender for another drink, his mind already formulating a plan. One way or another, he would get to the bottom of this. If what he suspected was true, Catherine had some serious explaining to do. And if he really did have a son out there? Alexander pulled out his phone again, this time dialing his private investigator. He built his fortune on calculating risks and uncovering hidden opportunities. Now it was time to apply those skills to something far more personal, discovering if the biggest secret of his life had been hidden in plain sight all along. The gala continued around him, but Alexander barely noticed. His world had shifted on its axis, and nothing would be the same after tonight. As he stared at the photo on his phone, studying the boy's familiar features, one thought kept repeating in his mind. Why? Why had Catherine kept this from him? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it now? The morning sun streamed through the windows of Alexander's penthouse office as he stared at the stack of papers his private investigator had just delivered. 3 days had passed since the charity gala, and he barely slept, his mind consumed by possibilities and questions. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. School records, medical files, and photographs spilled across his desk. The boy's name was Michael, and he was indeed 9 years old. Alexander's throat tightened as he studied a recent school photo, those eyes, that determined expression, even the way the boy held himself. It was like looking at his own childhood pictures. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Chen, your sister's here to see you," his assistant announced. Grace Chen walked in, her legal briefcase in hand. As both his sister and his company's chief legal counsel, she was the only person he trusted with this situation. One look at his face, and she knew something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, settling into a chair across from him. "Maybe I have." Alexander pushed the folder toward her. "Remember Catherine's sister Linda? I ran into her yesterday at that coffee shop near her dance studio. She was surprised to see me. Started talking about her nephew before catching herself and practically running out of there." Grace's eyes widened as she flipped through the documents. "Are you sure about this?" "The timing fits perfectly. Look at him, Grace. He's got our father's chin, our grandmother's eyes. There's even a note here about his exceptional math skills. He's already taking advanced classes. Have you confronted Catherine yet?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair. "I've been trying to figure out how. How do you start that conversation? Hey, by the way, did you hide my son from me for 9 years?" His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Grace reached across the desk and squeezed his hand. "You have rights, Alex, if this boy is really yours." "That's just it," he interrupted. "All these years, I've missed everything. First steps, first words, first day of school. I don't even know if he's allergic to anything or what his favorite food is. What kind of father does that make me?" "A father who didn't know," Grace said firmly. "This isn't your fault." Alexander stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. "You know what kills me? I keep thinking about why she did it. Was I really such a terrible husband that she thought I'd be a horrible father too?" The memory of their last big fight came flooding back. Catherine crying, telling him he was never there. That work always came first. He'd been so focused on building his company, convinced that providing financial security was the most important thing. Now looking back, he could see all the dinners he'd missed, the vacations he'd cancelled, the countless times he'd chosen a business meeting over spending time with his wife. "I need to see him," Alexander said quietly, "not just in pictures. I need to know my son." Grace nodded, already in lawyer mode. "We'll need to handle this carefully. I'll draft some papers." "No." Alexander turned back to face her. "No lawyers. Not yet. I need to talk to Catherine first, face to face. She owes me that much." Just then, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Linda, Catherine's sister. "We need to talk. Meet me at the park near your office in an hour." Alexander showed the message to Grace. "Well, looks like I might get some answers sooner than expected. Want me to come with you?" He shook his head. "I need to do this on my own." An hour later, Alexander sat on a park bench, watching children play on the nearby playground. Each boy's laugh made his heart clench, wondering if that's what Michael's laugh sounded like. The thought that his son had been living in the same city all this time, probably passing by his buildings, maybe even seeing his face in business magazines. Linda approached, looking nervous but determined. As she sat down beside him, Alexander noticed she was clutching a worn envelope. "Before you say anything," she began, "I want you to know I fought with her about this. For years, I told her you had a right to know." "Then why didn't you tell me?" "She's my sister." Linda sighed heavily. "But seeing you yesterday, I couldn't keep carrying this secret. It's not fair to anyone, especially not to Michael." She handed him the envelope. Inside were more photos, Michael as a baby, as a toddler, at birthday parties, playing baseball. Each image felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of all he'd missed. "He asks about you, you know," Linda said softly. Catherine told him his father was someone who couldn't be part of their lives, but he's smart. He's figured out there's more to the story. Alexander carefully tucked the photos back into the envelope, his decision made. Where does Catherine work now? She's an art curator at the Hamilton Gallery downtown. But Alex. Thank you, Linda. He stood up, straightening his jacket. For everything. As he walked back to his office, Alexander's mind was racing. He had a son, a brilliant, curious boy who shared his blood but didn't know his name. That was about to change. It was time for Catherine to face him and explain exactly why she'd kept this life-changing secret for so long. The truth would come out, one way or another, and nothing in his life would ever be the same. The Hamilton Gallery was quiet that afternoon, with only a few visitors wandering through its elegant halls. Alexander's footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he made his way to the curator's office. His heart pounded with each step, the envelope of photos feeling heavy in his jacket pocket. Through the glass door, he could see Catherine arranging documents on her desk, completely unaware of his presence. He watched her for a moment, remembering how she used to organize their home office the same way, everything in perfect order, each item in its place. When he pushed open the door, she looked up, and a color drained from her face. Alexander, what are you? We need to talk, he said quietly, closing the door behind him. About Michael. Catherine sank into her chair, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the distant sound of voices from the gallery. How did you find out? She finally whispered. Does it matter? Alexander pulled out the envelope and placed it on her desk. 9 years, Catherine. 9 years of my son's life that I'll never get back. You don't understand. You're right, I don't understand. His voice rose slightly before he caught himself. Help me understand how you could keep this from me. What gave you the right to make this decision? Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but there was also a flash of anger in them. What gave me the right? You want to know what gave me the right? She stood up, hands trembling. How about all those nights I spent alone while you built your empire? The anniversaries you missed, the vacations you cancelled. When I found out I was pregnant, you had just missed our last chance at marriage counseling because of a crucial business meeting. That doesn't justify. I was scared. The words burst out of her. I was terrified that my child would grow up feeling like they were second best to quarterly reports and board meetings, just like I did. Alexander fell silent, the weight of her words hitting him hard. He sank into one of the visitor chairs, suddenly feeling exhausted. You were never there, Alex, Catherine continued, her voice softer now. Even when you were physically present, your mind was always on work. I couldn't bear the thought of watching our child go through that disappointment. So you thought it was better to let him grow up without a father at all? The hurt in his voice was unmistakable. Catherine wiped her eyes. I told myself I was protecting him. Maybe I was really protecting myself, but seeing you at the gala, watching how much you've changed. I have changed, Alexander said. That workaholic who put business before everything. He learned his lesson. The hard way. He leaned forward, his voice intense. But you had no right to make that choice for me, for our son. Did you ever stop to think that being a father might have changed me sooner? Catherine looked down at the envelope of photos. Michael has been asking more questions lately. About you. He's so smart, so curious, just like you were before the business world consumed you. I want to meet him, Alexander said firmly. Not as some stranger, but as his father. He deserves to know the truth. It's not that simple. No, it's exactly that simple. He's my son, Catherine. I've missed 9 years of his life. I won't miss another day. She studied his face for a long moment. You'll need to take this slowly. He's sensitive, and this will be a huge change for him. I know. Alexander's voice softened. I don't expect to walk into his life and instantly be dad. But I need a chance. We both deserve that. Catherine nodded slowly. He has a science project presentation at school next week. Maybe you could come. Just to watch from the back of the room. See what he's like in his element. I'll be there. Alexander stood up, then paused. One more thing. Why didn't you ever ask me for money? You must have needed help. A small, proud smile crossed Catherine's face. I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it on my own. And I was afraid if I asked for support, you'd figure it out. As Alexander turned to leave, Catherine called out, Alex? I am sorry. Not for protecting our son, but for not giving you the chance to prove you could be the father he deserves." He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Walking out of the gallery, Alexander checked his calendar and cleared the entire next week. Nothing, no meetings, no deals, no business emergencies would keep him from that science presentation. This time, he would get his priorities right. This time, he would be there. And somehow, he would find a way to make up for all the moments he'd missed, one day at a time. As he stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight, Alexander felt both terrified and hopeful. In 1 week, he would see his son present his science project. It wasn't the first moment he dreamed of having with his child, but it would be a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings were the most important moments of all. The elementary school hallways buzzed with excitement as parents and teachers filed into the auditorium for the annual science fair. Alexander sat in the back row, his heart racing as he scanned the room. Catherine had texted him that morning. Michael would be presenting his project on renewable energy, a topic that made Alexander smile. Like father, like son. He spotted Catherine a few rows ahead, setting up a video camera. Then he saw him. Michael walked onto the stage, carrying his project board with careful determination. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. In person, the resemblance was even more striking. The boy wore a crisp blue button-down shirt, his dark hair neatly combed, looking every bit the young scientist. "Good morning," Michael began, his clear voice carrying across the room. "My project explores how we can use wind energy to power our homes more efficiently." Alexander leaned forward, captivated. Michael explained his project with impressive clarity, using hand-built models to demonstrate his points. When a technical term confused some audience members, he smoothly broke it down into simpler concepts, a skill Alexander recognized from his own presentations. During the queue of the session, Michael handled each question with patience and enthusiasm. One particular exchange made Alexander's chest tighten with pride. "But won't these wind turbines cost too much?" a parent asked. "Sometimes we have to spend more now to save later," Michael replied thoughtfully. "It's like when you buy a good backpack instead of a cheap one. It costs more, but it lasts longer and works better." That practical wisdom, delivered so naturally, reminded Alexander of his own father's teachings. As the presentation ended to warm applause, Alexander fought the urge to rush forward and introduce himself. They had agreed to take things slowly, to let Michael adjust to the idea gradually. After the presentations, Alexander watched from across the room as Catherine hugged their son, praising his performance. Michael beamed with pride, then suddenly looked in Alexander's direction. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Alexander saw a flicker of curiosity cross the boy's face. Later that evening, Alexander sat in his home office, replaying the video Catherine had shared with him. He paused on a frame where Michael was gesturing excitedly about his project, struck by how alive and passionate his son looked when talking about science. His phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. "He asked about you," said he noticed a man watching his presentation very carefully. "I think it's time we talk to him." Alexander's hands shook slightly as he typed his reply. "When?" "Tomorrow after school. He has a favorite spot in Central Park where he likes to do his homework. Meet us there at 3:30. That night, Alexander barely slept. He spent hours practicing what he would say, how he would explain his absence, how he would answer the inevitable questions. By morning, he had rehearsed a dozen different speeches, none of which felt right. The next day, he arrived at the park early, watching families play and children chase each other across the grass. At exactly 3:30, he saw them approaching. Catherine leading the way, Michael walking beside her, kicking small stones as they walked. They settled on a bench near the pond, Michael looking confused but curious. Catherine took a deep breath and began, "Michael, remember how you've been asking about your father lately?" The boy nodded, his dark eyes serious. "Well," Catherine continued, glancing at Alexander, "there's someone very important you need to meet." Alexander moved closer, his heart pounding. Michael looked up at him, and in that moment, he forgot all his rehearsed speeches. Instead, he simply said, "Hello, Michael. I'm your father." The silence that followed felt eternal. Michael's eyes widened as he looked between his mother and Alexander, processing this information. Then, in a small voice that carried the weight of 9 years of questions, he asked, "Where were you?" Alexander swallowed hard, choosing his words carefully. I didn't know about you, he said honestly. If I had, I would have been here. And I know that doesn't make up for all the time I missed, but I'm here now if you'll let me be. Michael studied him intently, in that serious way that reminded Alexander so much of himself. Mom says you build things. Companies and stuff. I do, Alexander nodded. But watching your presentation yesterday, I think you might be better at building things than I am. A small smile tugged at the corner of Michael's mouth. You saw my project. I did. Your explanation of wind turbine efficiency was really impressive. You know, I started my company working on similar environmental technology. As they talked, the initial tension slowly began to ease. Michael asked questions about Alexander's work, his life, and why he hadn't been around. Alexander answered each one truthfully, watching his son process each piece of information with remarkable maturity. When it started getting dark, Catherine gently suggested they should head home. As they stood up, Michael hesitated, then asked, "Will I see you again?" "As often as you want," Alexander promised. "We have a lot of catching up to do." Walking back to his car, Alexander felt lighter than he had in years. This wasn't an ending or a beginning. It was more like opening a door that had been closed for too long. There would be challenges ahead, trust to build, and relationships to repair. But for now, he had met his son, and that was enough to fill his heart with hope for tomorrow. The weeks following Alexander's first meeting with his son brought a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments for everyone involved. One Sunday afternoon, Alexander waited outside Michael's favorite bookstore, checking his watch nervously. This would be their first solo outing without Catherine present. Michael emerged from the store clutching a bag full of science books, his eyes bright with excitement. "Look what I found. There's this whole series about space exploration." As they walked to a nearby cafe, Alexander noticed how Michael's enthusiasm mirrored his own childhood passion for learning. Over hot chocolate and cookies, they dove into conversation about planets, rockets, and the possibility of life on other worlds. "Dad," Michael said suddenly, then quickly looked down at his cup. It was the first time he'd used that word, and it hung in the air between them. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. "Yes. Why did you and Mom really split up?" The question caught him off guard, but he promised himself to always be honest with his son. "I made mistakes," he said carefully. "I thought being successful in business was the most important thing. I forgot what really mattered, spending time with the people you love." Michael nodded thoughtfully, stirring his hot chocolate. "Mom says you work too much." "She was right." "I did, but I'm trying to change that now." "Is that why you cancelled your big meeting in Tokyo?" Alexander smiled, surprised he knew about that. "Yes, because this, spending time with you, is more important than any business deal." Later that week, Catherine called Alexander in a panic. "Michael's school just called. He has a fever, and I'm stuck in an important meeting across town. Could you text me the school address? I'm on my way." Alexander found Michael in the nurse's office, looking miserable and pale. On the drive home, his son dozed in the passenger seat while Alexander called his office to clear his schedule for the next few days. Setting up camp in Catherine's living room, Alexander discovered the challenges of caring for a sick child. He made soup, burning the first batch, found children's medicine after 3 pharmacy trips, and spent hours reading space books aloud when Michael couldn't sleep. Catherine came home that evening to find them both asleep on the couch, a half-read book about Mars exploration between them. She stood watching them for a moment, her expression soft and complicated. The next few days fell into an unexpected pattern. Alexander worked remotely from Catherine's apartment, taking calls in whispers and typing quietly while Michael rested. Catherine would come home from work, and they'd find themselves sharing quiet conversations over tea after Michael went to bed. "You're different with him," she observed one evening. The old Alexander would have sent an assistant to handle a sick child. "The old Alexander was an idiot," he replied softly. "I didn't know what I was missing." As Michael recovered, the boundaries between their separate lives began to blur. Family dinners became more frequent. Alexander started attending Michael's science club meetings. Catherine found herself calling Alexander for advice about Michael's school choices. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. One evening, during a heated discussion about Michael's summer plans, old wounds surfaced. You can't just sweep in and start making decisions, Catherine snapped. You weren't here for 9 years. Because you didn't give me the chance. Alexander shut back before catching himself. They'd both glanced guiltily at Michael's bedroom door, lowering their voices. I'm sorry, Catherine said after a moment. That wasn't fair. I'm used to doing this alone. And I'm trying to make up for lost time, Alexander admitted. Maybe we're both pushing too hard. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their past mistakes heavy between them. Remember when we used to dream about having a family? Catherine asked quietly. Back when we were first married. Alexander nodded, remembering those early days when anything seemed possible. We had it all planned out. Weekend picnics, family game nights. Michael loves board games, Catherine offered. He's surprisingly good at chess. Wonder where he got that from, Alexander smiled, remembering their own marathon chess matches during their marriage. The tension slowly eased as they talked about their son, his quirks, his talents, his dreams. They were finding their way toward a new kind of relationship, not as husband and wife, but as parents who both wanted the best for their child. As Alexander drove home that night, he thought about how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. His calendar, once filled with business meetings, now included science fairs and doctor appointments. His phone's photo gallery, previously full of corporate events, now overflowed with pictures of Michael's daily discoveries and achievements. He'd lost 9 years with his son, but he was determined not to lose another moment. And somewhere along the way, he was discovering that being a father was teaching him more about success than all his years in business ever had. That night, he received a text from Michael. Thanks for taking care of me when I was sick. Can we go to the Space Museum this weekend? Alexander smiled as he typed his reply. Wouldn't miss it for the world. The wounds of the past were still there, but they were healing, one small moment at a time. And in those moments, Alexander was learning that sometimes the biggest achievements in life had nothing to do with business deals or billion-dollar companies. Sometimes they were as simple as a child calling you Dad for the first time. The summer sun streamed through Alexander's office windows as he reviewed the final papers on his desk. After months of consideration, he had made a life-changing decision. His company's board members sat across from him, expressions ranging from concern to disbelief. You want to step down as CEO? His senior vice president asked, stunned. Alexander nodded, sliding the documents forward. I'll remain as chairman of the board, but it's time for new leadership. The company needs someone who can give it their full attention. Later that afternoon, he drove to Michael's school, arriving just as the final bell rang. His son bounded down the steps, waving a paper excitedly. I got an A+ on my science project, Michael announced, climbing into the car. And Mrs. Parker wants me to enter it in the state competition. That's fantastic. Alexander beamed, then took a deep breath. Actually, I have some news too. How would you feel about spending more time together? Michael looked at him curiously. What do you mean? As they drove, Alexander explained his decision to step back from day-to-day business operations. I missed too much already, he said softly. I don't want to miss anything else. When they arrived at Catherine's house to share the news, her reaction surprised him. Instead of the skepticism he expected, she studied him with understanding eyes. You really have changed, she said after Michael went to do his homework. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to their lives. Alexander threw himself into fatherhood with the same dedication he'd once given to business. He learned to navigate school pickup schedules, soccer practice, and science club meetings. His executive assistant was replaced by a calendar full of parent-teacher conferences and dental appointments. One Saturday morning, while helping Michael build a model rocket in the park, Alexander noticed Catherine watching them with an odd expression. Remember when you used to build things like this? She asked, sitting beside him on the bench. Before the business world took over? He did remember. The joy of creation had been what drew him to technology in the first place, before profits and shareholders became his focus. Michael has that same spark, Catherine continued. But he also has your determination. Yesterday, he spent 3 hours trying to perfect his robot design. Wouldn't give up until it worked. Alexander felt a surge of pride mixed with regret. I wish I'd been there to see him grow into who he is. You're here now, Catherine said softly. That's what matters. As summer progressed, their co-parenting relationship evolved into something neither of them expected, a friendship. They found themselves sharing coffee after Michael's school events, discussing not just their son, but their own lives, dreams, and regrets. One evening, after a successful science fair where Michael's project won first place, they celebrated with dinner at their old favorite restaurant. Michael had gone to sleep over at his best friend's house, leaving Alexander and Catherine alone. "You know what Michael asked me yesterday?" Catherine said, playing with her napkin. "He wanted to know if we still loved each other." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that love changes but doesn't always disappear." She met his eyes. "That sometimes people need to grow apart to grow into who they're meant to be." They sat in comfortable silence, both thinking about the path that had led them here. The anger and hurt that had dominated their divorce had softened into something else. Understanding, perhaps even wisdom. "I feel like I'm finally becoming the person you always wanted me to be," Alexander admitted. "Ironic, isn't it?" Catherine shook her head. "No, you're becoming the person you always were, before ambition clouded everything else." As they walked to their cars after dinner, Catherine stopped suddenly. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For proving me wrong. For showing Michael that people can change, that it's never too late to choose what really matters." That night, driving home, Alexander thought about how his definition of success had transformed. His company's stock price no longer seemed as important as Michael's proud smile when he mastered a difficult math problem. Board meetings couldn't compare to the quiet moments of helping with homework or discussing the mysteries of the universe. He pulled into his driveway and noticed a text from Michael. "Dad, can we work on the rocket again tomorrow?" "I think I figured out why it wasn't flying straight." Alexander smiled as he replied, his heart full. He might have lost 9 years, but every new day with his son felt like a gift, a chance to rebuild not just their relationship, but himself. The next morning, he woke up early, gathering supplies for rocket building. As he worked, he realized that stepping down as CEO hadn't felt like giving something up. Instead, it felt like stepping into the role he was always meant to play, not just a successful businessman, but a father who could finally give his son the time, attention, and love he deserved. And in that giving, he was receiving something far more valuable than any business success could provide: the chance to rediscover joy, wonder, and the simple pleasure of watching a homemade rocket soar into the summer sky.